How's it going? How's everyone doing today? Woo! Yeah, I trust, given it's an audience full of TPMs, I figure if I'm going overtime, someone's going to yell at me and things. So just keep me accountable, hold me accountable if I'm going overtime. Yeah, excited to be here. This was pretty last minute, so I appreciate the organizers for making this happen. Just to start off, how many people are familiar with Levels.fyi? Okay, nice. I like to see it. That's great. In some sense, I'm preaching to the choir over here, but I'll just give a little bit of background for folks that aren't as familiar with us. Before I get into that, though, I know a lot of you are familiar with us, but how many people have submitted salaries to Levels.fyi? Okay, that's nice. That's actually more than I would expect. So when we look at our analytics numbers and things like that, we see roughly about 1% of people that visit the site actually submit salaries. It's a much lower number, but so I'm glad that it's more than 1% over here. There were more than 4 people, so that's a that's a positive sign. To give some background, about 1 in 10 tech professionals visit the site every single month. That's within the US, and in the last 12 months, we've collected about 200,000 salaries. And this is across 22,000 different companies. So massive data set. How do we help folks? What do we do as a business, essentially? So you guys are probably familiar with the salary and company insights that we have on the platform. So you can go to the site, you can see how much people are getting paid, you can see how much different companies are paying for benefits and all these different things. We also have a community, which is a little bit less well-known, but we have a forum where people can discuss and ask questions. We have a job board, so you can actually go on there and look for a job. One of the coolest features about that actually is you can filter companies by how much they're paying. Obviously, right? I mean, we should have that as a feature. But I think it's one of the coolest features because I don't think many other job boards have it. So you can filter by total compensation. And then the last piece is our resume review and our negotiation services. And so this is one way that we make money, amongst others, is that we help people, people like you essentially, negotiate their job offers, and we help them improve their resumes. The people that are helping doing this, it's not me on the other end. I'm not a recruiter or whoever. We actually have ex and current recruiters at tech companies who are basically doing this every single day. They're the ones that are helping with the resume review and the negotiation service. And the cool thing, I think, the negotiation service is something that we're especially proud of. We've negotiated over $100 million in increases. It's probably, it's an older stat, it's probably much more now. But one of the coolest things is that it's a guarantee. So we either increase your money or, we give you a full refund. So it's essentially risk-free to actually utilize the service. And this is kind of when we started the site and the company, this is the kind of service that I would dream about when I was actually working as an engineer at Amazon and LinkedIn. So yeah, really excited to have that finally available for folks. This is kind of what the site looks like. This is the beloved TPM page. So you can go to the page and you can see the different leveling that we have across different companies, the different salaries, all of that. I trust most of you are familiar with it. This is the button I hope you all will click on by the end of the day. Please be sure to contribute your salary. Part of doing this, actually, and when I was chatting with Jannat, the founder of the TPM conference, what I was discussing with him is that we have a ton of data for engineers. We have, and actually I think it's on the next slide here. Oh no, it's not. It's on one of the slides, but I'll show you how much data we have for engineers. It's a ton. And the effect that has on engineers and what they're able to do in their careers because of it is massive. Engineers are able to figure out how much different companies are paying. They're able to figure out what the top companies are. They can figure out how to negotiate all of these different things, essentially empowering regular folks to build better careers and get paid more. And so we want to do the same for TPMs. We want to do the same for every profession. And so part of me coming here is to make a small pitch. Please do contribute back. The site is, it's a community resource essentially, and so we are beholden to you. And if there's any features or things that we're missing out on, let us know. But we also ask that you please contribute your data back. We have a little toggle where you can make it anonymous to make it more comfortable. But that is one of the biggest things that I hope folks will do after this. So how do we gather and validate data? There's a lot of skepticism in the community. There's a lot of misinformation as well often that happens. I think this is one of the things that we're most proud of is how we gather and validate data. Now, we're not perfect, so as we go through the slides, we're going to talk about, there's 3 things I want to cover for this presentation, right? It's compensation, careers, and Levels.fyi. I talked about the first bit for a little, but in terms of compensation, the more data we get, the more accurate we will be, and we'll go through that. But how do we generally maintain validity of the data set? So we gather data from people filling out the survey. The second thing is we also ask for proof documents. So people uploading like a W-2 statement or an offer letter. So this is literally, or their like annual review statements. So this is one way that we collect verified data. And then the last piece is our negotiation service. So through the service where we're helping people negotiate, we're also exposed to job offers. It's another way that we get verified data, and we have a whole system and a whole team of people actually literally just reviewing data day in and day out. And so that's how we actually maintain and validate data. Of course, there's always some slight imperfections, but when you look at the numbers in aggregate, we hope and we think that it gets a pretty clear picture. This is that data distribution graph I was telling you about. You can see how far ahead we have data for software engineers. It's almost, the other ones kind of don't come close on the chart. But product managers is, I think, the second most popular, and then we have TPMs closely after. About 2,000 data points in the last 12 months. Pretty big number for how many TPMs exist. So in proportion, you guys are actually doing quite well. But it is something we definitely want to improve, and I hope folks will consider submitting data. Okay, time to talk about numbers. I think this is what everyone loves to talk about. It's funny because when we started Levels.fyi, we didn't have salary data. And it's now everyone's like, oh, like Levels.fyi, the salary site, things like that, right? But like the reason why we're called Levels.fyi is because we just started by helping people compare levels, right? So you can see that a E5 at Facebook is the same as like a L4 or whatever at Google, or at Microsoft it's a 55 or something. For all the Microsoft people, I hate your leveling scheme. There's like 12 different levels. It gives me a headache. But that is what we started with. But of course, salaries is something that everyone is interested in, and we've added that shortly afterwards. So this is what the median that we have for in the US essentially. Now when we say median, this is not an average. Before I got into this whole thing, like I would always get confused between median and average. Now I know it quite well. The difference between median and average, and we typically use medians on the site, even though sometimes we'll say average. Median is more representative of what's actually happening. Average can be heavily skewed if there's like one person that's making like a crazy amount or another person that's making like a crazy little amount. The median is kind of, think of it as almost like if you put all of the numbers on a line and you picked out the middle one, that's what the median is, right? And so we feel it's more representative of what's actually happening in the market. And then you can see the different stats for the different percentiles. Now, what we'll get into is this number, you might be looking at that and saying, damn, that's a lot. And then there's others of you in the audience that are, wow, that's kind of low, right? And hopefully, depending what side of that you're on, that's what we'll kind of get into is like the meat of like what comprises that number and how companies set that number and what you can do about it to actually increase that number for yourself, right? So in terms of where do TPMs generally get paid the most? So this is like quite, in some sense it's obvious in hindsight, but Bay Area, San Diego, Seattle, the coastal cities, essentially what you would expect. Highest cost of living, of course. And then the type of companies that you'll see is kind of the FANG companies that you would expect as well, right? Nothing too surprising there just yet. One of the interesting things, though, is, depending on the type of company, now if we slice compensation, what actually happens, right? And so you'll see that, finance companies, and these are, this could be like Bloomberg, JP Morgan, things like that, the comp is drastically different than FANG companies and, tech companies as a whole. And so depending on the industry that you're in, and again, this may be slightly obvious, but it can have a drastic effect on compensation. And I think the reason why this is especially important for TPMs is they can operate across a huge variety of industries and domains, right? You can have a TPM at like a biotech company or a med device company or tech companies or finance or whatever. And so it's very important that when you're looking at, if you're trying to optimize or make certain decisions around compensation, that you're taking even the company that you're thinking of applying to in consideration, right? I think this is like a list of essentially top paying companies. And so you can see, we have Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Oracle. Oracle was actually a surprise for me. They're not typically like what I think of as like high compensation. But that's, one of the most interesting things as we go through this data set is like different companies pay at different tiers for different roles. So as an example, like some companies may pay more for software engineers, whereas they might not pay as much for TPMs, for instance, or vice versa, right? And so this is the case with like Oracle, for instance, where we feel that Oracle is actually paying a premium for TPMs as compared to what we typically see on the SWE side, on the software engineer side of things. LinkedIn stands out as kind of a top performer across all brackets. I used to work at LinkedIn and can confirm that their benefits and pay is often pretty great. So any people from LinkedIn in the audience? Anyone? Oh, nice. Okay, great. Yeah, great to see folks from there. So we'll get into, I'll sprinkle in some like career tips throughout, but essentially one of the biggest factors that affects your pay is negotiation. And we always tell people always, always, always negotiate. And you'd be surprised how many people don't negotiate. So I want to get a raise of hands again. How many people have negotiated their last job offer? That's pretty good. I'd say it's about like, I want to say 60% or so, maybe in that ballpark. Another question I'll ask is how many people know of someone personally, or for yourself essentially, have seen an offer get retracted for negotiating? Okay. There's about like 5-ish hands in the audience. And so one of the biggest concerns or fears of people for negotiating is that they're worried that their offer is going to get retracted. Now you can see from the numbers here, and this kind of lines up with what I've seen in my experience as well, is that the chances of that happening are slim to none for the most part. When that happens in some cases, it's often, there's different reasons. One is the company may have already be thinking of like another candidate, and so they use this as an excuse, right? Another is that if the person was negotiating extremely hard, then the company may get like a kind of a bad taste. So it's dependent on like, how you're negotiating too, right? But generally it doesn't happen. And like the cases that I've seen happen, they are very extreme cases. Like one guy went like 4 or 5 rounds of negotiating. Like you can't do that, but like you can do like, 2, 3 rounds of negotiating like fairly comfortably, right? So just something to keep in mind is, it's not I don't think it's a valid fear for most people if you're doing it respectfully in a good way, with a positive attitude. It's something that has a drastic impact on careers. If you think about at each step of your career, if you're negotiating each job offer increase, you kind of lock into that comp amount, right? So as you're working your way over your career, you're adding, let's say 10K a year even, which is a minimal amount. But every single year you're earning 10K more is a massive amount in when you do like the compound analysis or whatever, right? So always negotiate. Now, one of the interesting points I want to dive into is equity grows quicker as the level increases. Now, the reason why this is important is when we tie it back to negotiate, right, is when you are negotiating job offers, you likely don't want to focus as much on the base compensation, right? The base comp isn't moving as significantly as compared to the other components of compensation. The easiest components to negotiate is often like a sign-on bonus, or a second thing is equity. Why? Because they have much more variance essentially in what companies and comp professionals essentially allow for giving out. And so if we look back at this, you'll see that the salary stays fairly, it's growing consistently, but it's fairly stable, whereas the equity proportion is climbing almost at like an exponential kind of curve. And especially between L2, L3, L4, these are the areas where equity comp is kind of growing significantly over time. And so we're looking at, this is a breakdown of TPM comp by level essentially as well. Nice pretty graphic, obviously it's going up and to the right, which everyone loves to see. Second thing, again, like I mentioned, focusing on equity. The third piece here, so when we look at how compensation varies across different roles, and the reason I like to talk about this, especially for TPMs, is what we often find is TPMs often cross between roles pretty frequently, right? So more so than other roles perhaps that we see, right? So we often see TPMs coming from different industries, maybe even with a different role background, joining into a TPM. So I personally know of actually several people that were like mechanical engineers or other types of engineering that moved into TPM type of role. And then we also see people moving out of TPM roles into other groups. So like product management, or technical project management, or essentially other adjacent kind of roles in the space. And so the reason why that's important too is what you're seeing from this chart over here is that the gap between TPM compensation and other roles actually, unfortunately, essentially, increases over time with the level, right? So what that means is as you go further in your career, the gap between a person, that's in the same level but a different role is increasing over time if we compare it to some of these other top tech roles. So as an example, software engineering or product management or essentially like some of these other roles, you're going to see that gap kind of increase. And the reason why, again, that's important is you may want to think about, you may want to think about essentially how, as your career moves forward, how you're going to continue to, whether you want to stay as a TPM, whether you want to adjust, or maybe these days what we see a lot is also TPMs focusing, honing down on a particular skill set and becoming more specialist essentially in like a particular area, which allows them to kind of bridge that gap and that divide between kind of these other roles, especially on the product sense, right? If you're a TPM that's very in tune with the product and you can operate essentially as a product manager, well, one, you can actually transition into product management, which is relatively easier transition, but also you're owning a much larger piece of a company's puzzle, essentially. So yeah, this is that gap, essentially, if we look at it at non-FANG companies. Again, kind of just highlighting the difference between TPM and software engineer as the levels go up. Now, if we look at each level individually, and this is where we get into compensation philosophy. So over the years, we also work with compensation analysts and companies' HR departments, essentially. And so we've gotten a pretty good sense of how they actually set compensation over time. And so when we talk with these companies and how they actually set compensation, each company has a different comp philosophy, right? And like I mentioned earlier, different companies will pay different amounts for different roles, right? So something to look at is, and shout out to the LinkedIn folks in the audience, LinkedIn tends to be one of the most competitive companies for TPM compensation when we compare it across different roles, right? So when we look at TPM comp at LinkedIn, when it compares to like software or product management, it's one of the closest in terms of like gaps, essentially. So something to keep in mind as you're evaluating companies, that gap too at each company is gonna vary, right? And you can use that to your advantage, essentially. So we're looking at Amazon. What we generally find is at the first level, things are pretty consistent. So at Amazon and this is at Google, you can see that the comp is fairly similar. But as you're moving up to these other levels, it's increasing, and that only increases as you move into L3 and L4. Yeah, another company that's interesting, I think, is Cruise. Cruise is also comes up as as a leader essentially for compensation. This brings me to another tip on careers generally. Don't get stagnant, right? I've seen far too many people in their careers over time. If they're staying at the same company, they essentially get too comfortable at their roles or at their companies, and because of that, if they get laid off or if something happens, it's a much harder comeback for them to actually get into a new role. So, one of the things that we see obviously is that when you switch companies, that's when you're going to get the biggest bumps in compensation, right? It's generally it's well known to some extent, but the reasons for that may be lesser known. But when companies look at adjusting compensation, for the most part, if you don't have a significant milestone event, like you got promoted or you're leaving the company, and the company offers you like a retention package or something like that, for the most part, your increases are fairly small, right? They're not going to be massive increases, maybe a few percent, 2%, 5%, 7%, 10%. The biggest jumps that you're going to see oftentimes is when you switch companies. Now, companies are getting better at this. There's laws and things passing around making comp more equitable, even if someone is staying within the role. but that's not something you want to bank on necessarily, right? And there's other reasons why you want to switch roles quickly. And so especially now as AI and all these other things are happening, you want to make sure that you're being agile in your careers. And I think one of the best ways to do that, I always tell folks, is look for a new job every 4 to 5 years, right? Make sure that you're not staying in a certain place within 4 to 5 years. The second you pass that mark, or as you get, the longer you wait, the harder it is for you to re-enter the job market. And the skills have changed, the interview style has changed, so much has changed. And unfortunately, I bring this up especially because, especially right now, we've seen a lot of layoffs in the last year, essentially, last year or two. And I have many friends and friends of my parents even that have worked at companies for 5, 10 years and have gotten laid off and unfortunately can't find a job for like a year plus now, right? And that's a scary thought to happen. And so I convey this, especially given the moment right now, to make sure that you're being aggressive in terms of finding new roles as you go about your careers. Cool. I want to look at essentially how comp is trending over time. One of the most interesting pieces of this is companies don't typically reduce compensation. So when we see a line where comp is decreasing slightly over time, what that actually means is the job market is softening, right? Companies, when they're setting compensation bands, the way that they set it up is they set up a comp band for a particular level for every single level, right? Every year, they're looking at annual adjustments. For them, by and large, those annual adjustments are increases. Very, very rarely, almost never, will they actually be decreasing compensation. And so when you're looking at trend lines of, whether it's in our data or someone else's data, of comp decreasing, what that means is it's more reflective of the job market overall. That it's companies don't have to be as aggressive when they're giving out offers in terms of to attract someone. Right? So instead of having to go, at the top end of the band, they can stay maybe closer to the middle, right? And also, like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when the market was extremely hot, we were seeing exceptions, out-of-band exceptions. People were paying over the comp band, right? And that's not happening anymore, which is essentially reflected in this data here. This doesn't mean that comp is going down, right? I don't want to alarm people. All this means is that the market is softening slightly. And maybe you've experienced that, maybe you haven't. I think there are some blips, of course. So in April, it looks like there was a little bit of a blip, the increase, maybe the signs before. I think the stock market crashed in June, July, if I remember correctly. Or a lot of tech company stocks went down. Of course, they're back up now. So as this fluctuates, you're going to see different changes. But for the most part, it looks like comp has been stable. Another interesting insight is, this is one of the interesting things that I want to convey for, even if we don't have data at a particular company, how do you figure out how much comp should be at a company if we don't have data for it? And we get this question all the time, and it's interesting because there's different ways that you can figure out what comp is, even if we don't have much data for TPMs. And so the best way to do that is look at a benchmark, look at maybe software engineer comp, and kind of take a discount of what that comp looks like. So the general rule of thumb, you can see the different percent discounts over here based on level. So at L1, it's about -5%, L2, -7, 11, and then 24. If you do 5% for every level, so 5, 10, 15, 20, that's going to give you a rough ballpark, essentially, if you want, just as a rule of thumb. But essentially, just take a discount rate of companies, and you can figure out what comp is, even if we don't have that data. So as you're negotiating or as you're trying to figure out, hey, does this company pay well? I've heard a lot about this company. Does it actually pay well for TPMs? This is a good rule of thumb to keep in mind. Cool, that's pretty much it. I want to jump into questions and answers. This is the link to add your salary, as I mentioned. Remember that, guys? Don't forget about that. You can also share this link with your friends. This is essentially the link for TPM's specific link. Again, the more salaries that we have, the more insights that we have to share with all of you, essentially, and the more pay transparency there is for everyone. Yeah, I'll take some questions.
So a couple quick questions. When you're asking for salary, how are you covering and, so to speak, protecting people at smaller companies where they may only have 3 or 4 TPMs at most?
Right. Yeah, great question. So we have this little toggle here. Essentially, if you hit this toggle, if you don't hit this toggle, then we'll share basically all of the fields. If you hit this toggle, what's going to happen is we'll automatically hide fields until there are enough submissions for that particular field. So what I mean by that is, let's say there's only one TPM salary at company X, right? Now we'll hide your data point essentially. And when we say hide the data point has a lot of rich information. It has like, the breakdown of comp, it has the city, the location, all of these other things. So we'll hide that. We still show a general range, but it won't show any rich information. It'll just say like, okay, TPM at X company is within this ballpark. We take like a randomization, like a random amount before and after, basically your total comp value, and show like a general range. And so we make efforts to make sure that we're not showing basically certain things. We'll, for example, hide the city name if there aren't enough salaries for that particular city, and so on and so forth. And again, if you submit something and you don't feel comfortable, we have a little chat button on the website. Reach out on that chat button and let us know you want to take it down, and we'll be happy to take it down. So
Okay.
I don't want that to be like a limiting factor for folks.
Yeah, it's interesting. For example, I'm at a smaller company, and we've had people in single position roles go on blind and write their job title, and they write like total comp, and it's like, you just missed the whole point, dude.
It's funny because there's like limited awareness of that. I don't know what people think when they're doing that, to be honest, but it does happen. We see it sometimes.
I mean, it's easy to give an example of like these companies where you're talking FANGs and huge volume of people, but if you're at a company that's sub 500, 200 people, you don't have that flexibility.
Yeah. One other point, you can add prior role compensation on our site too. And so it doesn't have to be the current role that you're in. Let's say you had an offer 2 years ago. Please add that as well, because that helps us get this more complete picture of what's happening historically over time. And we backdate it in our data set, so we factor all of that in to make sure that it's handled correctly.
The other quick question I have is you mentioned Cruise as an example, but they had a high compensation level, it was widely known, but then they also just had massive layoffs. Right, for product failure. So is there any tracking, so to speak, of the companies that do have higher compensation levels versus how fast they turn over employees kind of on fast fail programs?
Right. That's a good point. We don't have that today. It's something that we want to look into. It's funny because we don't actually have reviews on the website yet, which is like, people always say, oh, it's like Levels versus Glassdoor or Blind or whatever. And like, we don't have reviews at all. We're just very, very focused on compensation, but it is a gap and we're working on adding that soon. But when we do, I think those are some of the things that we want to factor in is, turnover and, work-life balance, all of that sort of stuff.
Cool. We have a question from our online viewers. There are like a bunch of questions. I'll try and combine them.
Okay.
So it says like TPM comes from different backgrounds with different domains based on like different technical knowledge. So should the salary they get paid be taken as benchmarks? The other part of the question is the slides that you were sharing, did that include like base plus like stocks and stuff?
Yeah.
And the last part is what is your salary expectation? That's a question. How should we like answer that?
Yeah, great question. Okay, I'll start with the second one. I'm probably gonna forget, so just please remind me about the questions. But essentially, we talk about total comp always. Total comp is important. When we started the website, people would come to us all the time and be like, hey, what the hell, these numbers look way too high. And then I would be like, you know what, you're not factoring in equity. So how are you gonna compare a base salary to an offer that includes equity, right? And equity at top tech companies is almost as good as cash. Obviously in the last 2-3 years, if you look at that, it's probably gonna disprove my point slightly. But generally speaking, we always look at total compensation, base plus equity plus bonus, right? And we average that over your vesting duration. And the reason why that's important is because, it's pretty self-explanatory, but that is the number that you're taking home at the end of the day. The third question around, if you are asked for salary expectations, what do you say in a negotiation? We face this all of the time. And our advice is always don't share a number. it never benefits you for the most part to share a number. If you say a number too high, the company may be like, hey, that's too high for us, right? If you share a number too low, then you're kind of selling yourself out of a higher number later on. So it almost never benefits you to share a number. Why do it, right? I don't think there's any purpose generally. Some companies will press you very hard for that. And there's like a video online, if you just search my name or Levels negotiation help, there's like a YouTube video where I actually walk through like a live scenario with someone, like a mock negotiation. And so you can see how we talk about responses and stuff. But generally, like worst case scenario, you can try to provide a range or say something to the effect of like, hey, I saw the comp you posted online and I'm comfortable with that range. Because these days, companies have to post like comp ranges. By the way, those ranges that companies post, funny story, they're not super accurate. So the ranges that companies post on job descriptions, one, the regulation and the laws around that, they don't necessarily specify that it has to be total compensation. Most of the time, it's actually sometimes just base salary. And then the other thing is, sometimes they'll put a role for like senior TPM or senior engineer. When they say senior, it could potentially span multiple levels. It could be L2 plus L3, for instance, right? Or it could be 3 levels or something. And so I'm sure you've seen those memes of like Netflix having like a range between like 100K to like $1 million. Well, like that's where that sort of comes from, is like they have like an open, I mean, obviously that's an extreme, like they've taken it way too far, but it comes from the fact that when companies post a role, sometimes they're willing to take people at different levels, like L2 and L3, right? And so they'll share the most broad range. So it's effectively useless. Like people have tried to like come up, like generate the pictures that we do, right? All of these fancy graphs around comp and stuff using salary ranges in job descriptions. But if you look at that data, we've tried to do it ourselves. Frankly, it's like somewhat useless for actually getting a pretty accurate picture of what's happening. What was the first question? I'm sorry.
So the first one was like different TPMs, different companies, different skill sets. So should like the salaries be benchmarked?
No, every industry, like I mentioned, like every industry is going to pay something slightly different. And so, which is why it's important to know which industries pay more, so that you can kind of focus on the industries that you think might pay higher if that's your goal and if that's something you want to do. Yep.
Hey, thank you for sharing a lot of insight. So just a few call-outs. I don't know, I haven't used Levels.fyi for a while, but I don't know if there's an improvement. 2 features. One is the equity. Equity, I think for us, everyone, it's very important for us to reference to the number that is offered when the job is offered.
Right.
Like, I saw some noises when I checked the numbers. Some people may just enter the stock price on that date,
right?
Which is a bit confusing. It can be up or down, right?
Right.
Fluctuates. That's one. The second one is I forgot about the question. Sorry.
It's all right. I forget upstairs too, so I can answer the first and then come back.
Yeah. I'll let you answer the first question first.
Cool. So that's a great question, and it's an important question, and I think it's a question that people often confuse a lot. And there are different schools of thought over here. I will share our perspective. It's one way of doing things. It may not be the right way for everything, but it is one way, and I think we have important rationale for why we do so. So when you enter comp on our site, essentially, there's essentially like a fork in the road. We ask you, is this a new offer, or are you currently at the company? If it's a new offer, things are pretty straightforward. You enter what your grant amount is. Base salary is easy, and we ask you for your vesting schedule, things like that. There's no variation, no fluctuation in terms of appreciation or depreciation of stock just yet. If it's an existing offer, what we ask is the total equity amount that you're going to get for the current year, right? What does that mean? So let's say you worked there for 3 years. You have your initial stock package that you got, and then you also got like a refresher package, right? And so what we ask for is the total amount that you would get in the current year. And we ask it from the perspective of what you would, essentially the current value of those shares. Now that's different from what you were saying, which is the initial value, right? So this factors in, when we ask for it, we actually ask to factor in appreciation and depreciation. Why do we do that? Because it affects the market, right? What I mean by that is, if you look at some companies, will actually not give refreshers if their equity has appreciated considerably in the market, right? Other companies, if the equity package has gone down, they may give more refreshers, right? Or they may not, and so you're actually stuck at a lower comp for the duration. The other thing is if let's say someone works at NVIDIA, shout out to all the NVIDIA, anyone from NVIDIA here? Any millionaires? Oh, they don't have to be here, you see? That's a pretty telling sign, they don't have to be here. But if you were at NVIDIA, your stock has appreciated considerably. You're likely a millionaire at this point, shout out. But that affects the market. If a company wants to hire someone from NVIDIA, they're not going to be able to pull them. It does affect the market, and that's the reason why we actually get the current amount, basically, because companies also, when they set compensation, when they're thinking about giving refreshers, they factor all of this in, and so we should too.
Here we go. So I remember the second part. So when we enter the number, apparently different companies do the total comp from year 1 to year 4, typically or year 3, depending on how the vesting schedule is. Is there any way to improve to just enter the way we were offered, but on your end you have a formula to make it even, so it's a reference point for when we negotiate the offer? Does that make sense?
Sort of. So are you talking about like an irregular vesting schedule where it's like
right, so
backloaded or front-loaded?
Exactly. So okay. they're not equal. Like the first year, the TC is very different than the year 3 or year 4, depending on the companies, right?
Okay. So for new offers, we collect all of that. You tell us your sign-on bonus for year 1, year 2, year 3, etc. You also tell us what the vesting schedule is. So we collect all of that detail. It's a very, very detailed form, which I know if you guys are like halfway through the form, just keep going through. It doesn't take that long, trust me. It's a long form, but the reason why it's somewhat longer than we don't just ask you your total comp. We ask you for all of this other information so that we can actually come up with insights and get a much better sense of what's happening, right? And it only takes like 2 to 5 minutes. It doesn't actually take that long. I know it looks long. But going back to your point, when it's a new offer, we collect all of that. The thing is, when you're at the company, it gets very, very tricky to collect all of those because people have oftentimes multiple grants. They have I got a grant when I joined the company, and then I got a refresher, and then I got another refresher, and then I got a bonus this year, right? So what we ask is just kind of the normalized, how much are you making this year in each department, in equity, in bonus, in salary, and so on and so forth. But for new offers, we do collect all of that variation.
Thanks. I think one of the most interesting things about Levels.fyi is the visual where you can see how roles compare across organizations, L5 at Amazon versus L6 at Google, et cetera. Can you give a little bit more information or insight about the process that Levels.fyi uses and maybe some heuristics about how those lines between the levels are drawn and how they're compared across companies?
Yeah, great question. And I love talking about levels because that's what we started with. But the way that we come up with those graphics, so what he's chatting about is, where is it? It's all the way at the beginning. Here. So this, you can't, it's cut off a little bit, but you can see here, you can select a company name, and then right beneath here, we have this graphic visual of where we collect the levels across different companies. So the way that we come up with this is we ask people literally for the leveling rubrics. At a company, they'll typically have a rubric that says, at L1, this is your role and expectations, right? This is not based on compensation. I'm going to repeat that again. This is not based on compensation. The leveling comparisons are not based on compensation. And that's very important because people often confuse that. It is based on role and scope of responsibilities. So let's say you as L2 now are managing 3 teams, right? Versus L4 might be managing 3 departments, right? Not just a team, like department level. And so we look at what those rubrics are. Literally speaking, we'll get rubrics from different companies that people have submitted, people just like you guys, that they submit the rubrics to us, and we look at those and compare the scope and responsibilities to make sure they're equivalent. The other way that we do this is anecdotes, because that doesn't cover the full picture. Some companies over-level, right? When I was at LinkedIn, and I don't know if this is still the case, but LinkedIn was notorious for over-leveling. So they would give out a senior engineer to someone that was just a junior engineer, right? Things like that. And so we also look at anecdotes of what's actually happening in the market. So we'll literally go on LinkedIn and like, if someone has the level in their role, we'll look at how they moved from one direction to another. And then also we have a negotiation service. So when we're helping people negotiate offers, we can also get insight into how they're moving across different companies. It's not perfect. And we always tell people, treat the lines as fuzzy. Those aren't meant to be strict boundaries. The reality is that if you do really well on an interview, you can get bumped to the next level, right? And if you fail an interview, you might get down leveled, right? And so treat the levels as a boundary because in practice, in reality, it is a very, very fuzzy boundary. Yep.
We'll take a couple of questions and from online, and then we can go to in person.
Cool.
All right, so one of the questions is, how are you protecting people's data, especially when they're uploading their W-2s and personal info?
Right. Yeah, so the way we protect it, so I used to be an engineer at AWS, by the way. So AWS, like I have a lot of experience at AWS, and we use AWS for our backend. When you upload an offer document, it's literally going into our bucket. It's a secured bucket. Only a few of us have access to it, essentially. And it's essentially encrypted on disk and in transit, all that. Like the basic stuff that every company does with information, we do kind of all of that, essentially, as well. And those offers are never exposed on the site. There's no access path for those offers to be exposed on the site anywhere, essentially, right? And we have like a review process where we go through those offers, but yeah, I mean, we take all of the regular precautions that any company would, and making sure that we've had those encrypted and they're securely stored and all of that. Yeah.
Test?
I think.
Awesome. Yeah, I was just curious, and maybe this is a vision question for Levels. At Amazon, we do the tech survey. And since you're verifying respondents, I would imagine you'd be able to eliminate some of the noise in the data set. And that seems like that might be valuable, a complement to your data set to know what are the sentiments of working at a given company, regardless of the salary.
Right. Yeah, so I see this as part of like reviews to some extent. We're working on it. We don't have it yet. The thing we want to be careful with reviews is, honestly, like we've seen how Glassdoor and a lot of other companies have like kind of lost trust in this space. And so we want to be very, very careful when we do reviews to do it right. And what that means is we want to, we're still ideating here. We're still trying to figure out how do we do this in a way that we're protected legally so that if a company comes and sues us for like defamation or something, that we're not, screwed. At the same time, we want to make sure that people are able to actually share things comfortably without fear of any repercussion. And so we're thinking about things like being able to share a review. It's not tied to your user account at all. You just submit the review. It's fully anonymous, and there's not even a way to like, there's no way to tie it back to you, basically. But you still have maybe giving people a way to update it if they want to. So doing things like an anonymous link or something. I'm not really sure, but the point is we want to do this right. We haven't cracked it yet, but hopefully when we do in the next couple months, then we'll release it. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Harsh. I just have a quick question around, and I haven't visited the site, so maybe it could be off. But what are the trends in general, let's say for TPM role, from the point of view of linking the salary with the role and the skill set? Now, I'm not sure whether you are gathering that information, but if there is something which you can talk about it. And my second question was, for this type of website, there were already big websites already there like Glassdoor. So what motivated you to particularly focus on this particular aspect of the job search and the career industry as such? Thanks.
Yeah, great questions. I think the answers are tied, honestly. So the way that we connect comp with scope and responsibility is by level, right? So we have the leveling structures at almost all of the top tech companies and many, many more, hundreds of levels across different companies. And so when we tie it to a level, that is the most accurate way to determine, to tie, it's the most accurate way to tie comp to a scope, essentially. because that's how companies determine scope. So we use what the companies use, essentially. And the reason why we started Levels, it's literally because it was very hard to compare leveling across different companies. I was an engineer at LinkedIn. I moved to Amazon. When I was in that process at LinkedIn, I got promoted to a senior engineer. And I wanted to, when I joined Amazon, I wanted to make sure I was joining as a senior engineer. They offered me a regular software engineer. So I was like, hey, what the hell? I'm a senior engineer. Please, can you help me figure this out? The thing is that Amazon, at their second level, they actually call it regular engineer. It's their third level that is called senior engineer. But I didn't know that Amazon had this internal leveling, L4, L5, et cetera. And so that's what we started by, the website initially was just helping people compare these internal levelings across different companies. So that when you switch jobs, you know which level you should come in at and that you're not underleveled, right? And that affects compensation. And it's why we also got into salaries, because Glassdoor doesn't really collect levels properly, even to this day. And so you can't actually see for different levels what the comp is. You can't see like a pretty picture, the pictures that we have about the salary increasing at every level. You can't generate that if you don't have the right information about what the levels are at different companies. I think there was one question here. I just want to. Okay.
How do you actually check the authenticity or verify the salary that members like us actually submit on the platform? Do you have like a legal process?
Yeah. So the way question was about verification. How do we verify salaries, essentially? One is, there's power in aggregate, right? When we have so many data points, we have obviously like anomaly detection, all of the regular statistical outlier detection, all of this basic stuff, right? But on top of that, that's where the proof documents come in. We collect proof documents, like PDFs literally, offer letters from individuals. But we don't just stop there. We also, when we have career services, so we have our team of coaches that are helping people negotiate, when they're helping you negotiate essentially, we also keep track of those numbers of what's happening at different companies. And typically we actually figure out two numbers, the number of the company that you were leaving from and the number of the company that you're joining. And so that gives us a very rich data set, very accurate. The most verified data that we get is from that service because we're working with people one-on-one to figure out what comp is. And we use that as kind of like anchors in our data set to help trim off any like extraneous data points. Yep.
Thank you, Zaheer. I think we are about time, and thank you everyone for great questions, and thank you for great presentation. We have 10 minutes now for networking. Feel free to meet Zaheer if you have more questions, and then we all meet here for a closing note for TPM Summit 2024.
Thank you all.